All right. This is a story that I wrote. This is dedicated to a cousin of mine who I was very close to and who died very recently.
Oh, yeah, I heard about that. Fuck.
Yeah.
That's very sweet.
Actually found out about it while we were reading the one that Uber wrote. So there's a little bit of a connection between those two. Yeah. This is about dealing
That's
with
cool.
death, basically. So this has obviously the story deals with death and grief, as well as a brief mention of gender issues.
I thought
Description.
you said I was poisoned by the Taco Bell fix, so I heard in my brain death and beef.
No.
I'm
Sorry.
um, it's okay. This is a black umbrella for Rose Lalonde. Summary. June Egbert is still coming to grips with the one inescapable fact she can't seem to understand. Rose Lalonde is dead. A requiem for a friend, told backwards in time.
I guess I guess I'm still getting to the point where this feels real.
June sighed and took the hand that Jade offered, looking up at her sister and feeling the burn of the tears in her eyes, glinting in the warm fall sunlight, but ultimately refusing to fall.
Do do you know what I mean?
Jade shrugged and looked around from her spot in the reserved seating, at the sea of black suits and dresses that were still milling around the graveyard. June watched her eyes intently as her expression showed a flash of the pain that was lurking inside. Finally, Jade returned her gaze to her sister and nodded slowly.
Hello.
This is it, June.
Lost.
Third
Yeah,
paragraph.
I do. Thank you. Sorry, guys.
You're
Dropped
good.
the ball.
No one came over to speak to them. No one here felt especially comfortable approaching two grieving gods and asking them how they felt. Dave had already come and gone, saying little and choked up with tears that refused to come out. Roxy, too, her face lined with so many layered emotions that June felt deeply uncomfortable asking her how she felt. Finally, she had, and Roxy simply looked at her and looked at Jade, and then said nothing. It was more than enough to let everyone present know how she was feeling. Then alone for a while, watching the sea of black clothing, June felt strange seeing this. In spite of all the death she'd seen and the trauma they'd been through, she'd never actually been to a funeral. She'd brought a black umbrella with her. That was what you were supposed to do at funerals. Except it wasn't raining. Instead, it was a gorgeous mid-October day, with the sun hitting the red and golden leaves in a way that sent flashes of color everywhere. The last final bit of true beauty coming from something that was dying.
June?
Jade's voice interrupted the reverie, teasing in softly at the edges of June's awareness.
We should go check up on her, you know?
June nodded, slowly, feeling too numb to stand up. But she did stand up. She let go of Jade's hand, and she stood, and she put one foot in front of the other as she walked down the side of the reserved seating section, over to a single figure who sat in the very front row. She wasn't wearing a black dress, but rather one of vivid red that stood in stark contrast to her light gray skin. No one had had the audacity to ask why she eschewed tradition, even though it was a tradition that was utterly foreign to the Alternians. But she'd given any potential naysayers a single response. She asked me to wear this when she died. And that was all that Kanaya Merriam had to say on the subject to anyone. In spite of her reluctance to get up in the first place, June was at Kanaya's side, a full 3 paces ahead of Jade. She leaned in and spoke softly, not wanting to break the spell that was falling over this place, not wanting to ruin these last moments of her dear friend's existence.
Kanaya, is there anything we can do for you?
Slowly, the troll turned around, and June could see the hollows behind her eyes, the spaces where the feeling had been until she'd cried it all out. Kanaya smiled slightly and nodded to June, then turned to look at Jade, and a look passed between them that was harder to read. I am doing as well as can be expected, Kanaya said quietly. given that I have just lost my wife. She sighed and turned to look, and June followed her gaze. Followed her gaze along the line of black-clad well-wishers that were starting to disperse already. Followed along the well-tended grass of the cemetery. Followed along to the newly turned patch of dirt where Rose Lalonde was buried. The sound of the phone ringing woke June up from her nap, jolting her up from near dreamless sleep and sending her pitching forward in her chair before she was able to steady herself. She fumbled for the phone, picking it up to reveal the name glowing in the dim light of her apartment. Jade Harley, sis.
Hey, Jade, what's up?
June struggled to keep the sleep out of her voice, but as soon as she heard Jade's response, she knew it didn't matter.
June, Rose just passed away.
It wasn't real. It wasn't real because it couldn't be real, because she'd just been thinking about giving Rose a call earlier that day, because she had just been messaging Rose a few days ago about something, watching as Rose spun out paragraphs of text that were somehow never a chore to read. Because even though she knew that Rose was so very sick, dying was what Kanaya had told her, not sick, but dying, maybe something would turn around. They were, after all, gods. Gods didn't get sick. Gods didn't die.
Oh, what?
It was all June could force out of her mouth. She heard Jade sigh into the phone, long and heavy and sad.
Really sorry, Junie. Kanaya just told me she's not doing very well. Going over there to make sure she's okay overnight. Just need to pack some things.
Rose?
Again, she couldn't finish the sentence. Rose, the one she'd opened up to first about how deeply she'd been hurting. Rose, the one she'd talked to back before she was willing to put a voice to how she was really feeling about herself. The one who'd looked at her and seen June when she wasn't even ready to see that of herself. And swallowed, and the lump in her throat barely refused to budge.
Sorry, I have to scroll in two places.
No, you're good.
This doesn't feel real.
Still felt like she was on the border between dreaming and waking, the vague hope that maybe she'd simply slipped into a nightmare that she could come up from.
I know, Junie. I know.
On the other end of the phone call, a short, muffled sob. Jade, who loved Rose. Jade, who had been welcomed into her home. Jade, who had known that this was coming. That hadn't made it hurt even a bit less.
I just wasn't expecting it to happen so soon.
June nodded, her head feeling like it was packed with cotton.
Rose, I'm sorry, Jade. I'm so sorry.
There is something which I need to discuss with you. Anaya Merriam's voice was sharp and crisp, cutting across the early September morning with the practiced ease of someone who has become accustomed to being listened to. Regarding your sister and my wife. June stopped walking and turned to look at Kanaya. She'd been out in the park by herself, taking in the day. For the first time in the year, it was cool enough for her to comfortably wear the long coat that she bought. The first piece of clothing she'd ever bought that made her feel like herself. She hadn't expected company. She wasn't going to shoo Kanaya away.
Oh, hey, Kanaya. How's Rose doing? I haven't actually heard from her in a little bit.
June trailed off and a sour feeling blossomed in her stomach. She had a painful feeling that she knew what this was about.
Ever since she told me about, you know.
June frowned. I do, in fact, know. Kanaya sighed and closed the rest of the distance between her and June, looking around the park and drawing in the sights. It really is lovely here, isn't it? She smiled softly and finally stopped by June's side. June nodded.
What you want to talk about?
Kanaya shifted and looked around, her face growing dark and her eyebrows knitting in the middle. So, I take it that Rose has not told you? This will be somewhat more awkward than I had imagined.
Tell me what?
June could feel the sour feeling boiling, bubbling, turning into bile that churned around and around.
What's wrong?
Naya sighed. I suppose there is no point in making a confectionery out of it. Rose is dying.
What? Kanaya, what the fuck are you talking about?
She shook her head quickly and stared at Kanaya.
If this is some kind of fucked up joke, I'm not.
She stopped. Kanaya wasn't smiling, and the soft glint of tears could be seen in the corner of her eyes.
You're not joking.
I would never do such a thing to you or anyone else, Kanaya said quietly. Rose is, in fact, dying. The precise mechanisms are unclear, but we are uncertain how much time she has left.
We?
June squinted, and this stuck out in her.
Is this about Jade too? Is Jade dying?
The reality of what Kanaya had just said about Rose was still weeks away from fully setting in. Kanaya could have told her that Rose was growing a second head, or that she was a robot, and it would have made just as much sense and felt just as real. But Kanaya only shook her head quickly and looked down at the ground, at the still green grass shining vibrantly in the late summer light. No, Jade is not also dying. As a matter of fact, she has been a source of strength to both of us in these times, a veritable beacon of love and comfort. Kanaya sighed again and clasped her hands in front of her, picking softly at the web of her thumb. We wish the details of our relationship to remain private, given Rose's high profile as an author and Jade's desire to remain out of the public eye.
But why are you telling me this?
The reality of what Kanaya was saying still refused to stick, refused to be something other than a vague abstraction.
What am I supposed to do?
Be there for Jade, mainly. I suspect that the two of us will be rather in a bad way once Rose passes. There it was again, the idea that Rose could just suddenly be gone, and what possible sense did that make? Gods didn't get sick. Gods didn't die.
Can you at least tell me what's happening to her? Rose, I mean? You seem so sure, but aren't we all immortal?
June could hear the wavering desperation in her own voice. The need for this to be anything other than it was. The need for stability and normality after everything that they'd... Rose couldn't be dying, because she'd been through so much already. It wasn't heroic. It wasn't just. It simply is, Kanaya said firmly. We do not know the specifics of why, but Rose is quite certain. We are in the mind of preparing for this rather than trying to run from it. We have had a good amount of time together. 15 years is a fair amount by the standards of most relationships.
I know, but I don't get it. Rose, do you have a minute to talk?
June could feel her voice quaking over the phone. Except she hadn't been called that back then, hadn't had the courage to admit it to anyone yet. She heard Rose answer, sounding tired but alert, something that only Rose seemed to be able to really pull off.
Yes, Sean, what is it? I was in bed, but if this is a matter of importance, then I can certainly make time for an old friend.
Her voice perked up as she talked, becoming more alert. June smiled to herself. This was the Rose she'd known for years and years. The Rose who had always been there for her.
Okay, so you know how I was telling you before about how much it sucked to be inside of Spurb?
Rose laughed softly into the phone.
Oh, I think the word sucked dramatically undersells the nature of that particular problem.
I know. Well, I guess I got to thinking about it and I was wondering something, if you don't mind answering something kind of personal?
No, I don't have a problem with that, John. Ask away, and I will do my utmost to answer you in a way that is both comprehensible and honest.
Do you ever feel like you're a different person now? Like what we went through in Suburb made us different?
June finished the sentence feeling silly, like she was hanging something out in the open that didn't make any actual sense. Rose didn't respond with laughter or mocking. Instead, she hummed softly.
Well, we are in a very basic and fundamental sense of the word different people than we once were. We are, for one thing, immortal, or near immortal at least. I'm unsure how the rules work now that the clock of fate has been smashed and we exist in a wholly different universe from where it once held sway. But yes, I think it would be quite normal to feel a bit out of sorts in general.
Okay, good.
June stopped and waited. She waited for her heart to slow down, waited for the feeling of dread to stop crawling around inside of her so she could calm down and think.
But what if I feel like I've actually been a different person for a while now? Like before Suburb a while now?
She sighed and tapped her fingers along the side of her thigh.
Like maybe what we went through in Suburb didn't change us at all, but it just made things come out. Things that we didn't want to think about because it felt like they were way too much, you know?
Well, I suppose I can't rightly say that I know exactly what. But your point is well taken. It is certainly a consideration to have.
I've been thinking about Pfeffrey and what she could do for me, Witch of Life and all that. Maybe that's silly, and maybe it won't end up being anything, and maybe I'm just kind of stuck, or maybe things will be way harder than I thought, but I think it's worth a try.
Rose's voice was confused, uncertain of what she was hearing. June didn't blame her. This was a lot to take in all at once. It had been a lot for her to think on all those lonely nights and long days, wondering if things had been different. Maybe things
John?
could be different.
John?
Hey, Rose,
Yes, John?
can can you stop calling me that?
When she spoke again, there was no judgment in Rose's voice, not a hint of even the slightest trace of hostility. Instead, there was a warmth and depth of understanding. Even now, outside of the game, she was a seer at heart.
Oh, I think I get it.
June could hear the smile in Rose's voice.
I was wondering what that had meant. When I saw what I saw all those years ago in the clouds, it seemed like a vision of another reality. But I understand now.
She laughed, the sound light and rich and musical.
I understand now, June.
June felt her eyes water. And then the tears broke, and she was crying into the phone. Standing over the newly turned dirt, the small marker that had been requested by someone who wanted to have their legacy be told more by their actions than by their commitment to the garish, June Egbert began to cry, finally. The tears began to drip down, running down her cheeks and along the line of her jaw. June reached up and wiped her eyes with the back of a hand, only to find that new tears came in the wake of the old.
I miss you, okay? I guess I never really thought that this would happen. I always figured you'd find some way out of it, figure something out, or just get better, and no one would even know why.
June shrugged and frowned down at the raw dirt.
I guess I didn't want it to be you, too. After everything we'd been through together, and you were the first person I felt comfortable telling so much about myself.
June sighed and shook her head. The autumn sun was still high in the sky, warming her skin under the plain black dress she'd worn to the funeral. Rose hadn't asked her to wear anything special, so she'd gone with something that felt respectful, or at least something that let her blend into the sea of onlookers who come to pay their last respects to their idol, their role model, their inspiration. But Rose hadn't been any of those to June, not really. Her closest friend. Someone whose passing would leave a piece of her heart forever gone. Not in that she was broken now or incomplete, that it would hurt. It would take time to heal. That she would still have those moments when she woke up thinking she could text Rose about something funny or profound or mundane. Not particularly amusing or heartwarming. that she could reach out if she was ever feeling bad about herself.
I'm always gonna miss you, Rose.
June lifted the black umbrella, the only one at the funeral, and opened it against the sunlight. Instantly, her face was cast into shadow, and she could feel the chill of the fall air. All around her, there was the sense that this was a place of rest, new beginnings. Even if she didn't want to, she would have to continue on with that piece of her heart left bloody and raw until she woke up one day to realize that she'd been healing all along. She could look back on her memories and not feel like she was about to break down into tears. Without another word, June turned and began to walk toward the cemetery gates. She spared a single backwards glance at the grave marker, at that underwhelming summary of a woman's entire life and legacy.
I'll visit again soon, okay? That one made me cry the first time I read it.
Oh,
Yeah.
It was a
Wish
good
I had
fit.
tear.
thank you.
Tear ducts.
What?
What?
I didn't hear what you
Sorry.
said.
Just musing to myself.
Uh-huh. Normal
Yeah.
stuff.